In this video, we are going to talk about prompt templates in Langchain. So what are prompt templates? Prompt templates are a reproducible way of generating prompts. And so what happens usually is that you don't feed the user input directly to the large language model for prediction. Rather, you basically take that particular input, feed it into a large piece of text, generally called as a prompt template, and then pass that prompt template to the model for prediction. And so generally a prompt template is made up of different parts. So we have instructions. Um, Next, we have few short examples so that the model generates output which is meaningful. And finally, we have the user input or the question that needs to be answered. So now the first step is to import important libraries. Next, generally prompt template is of two types. One, we have a normal large language model completion type of a prompt template where we usually just pass a normal text string to the model. So in this case, the template is you are a programming assistant. What is the syntax to print hello world in some language, so which is an input variable for this particular template. And finally, we fill in the prompt, or we fill in that particular input variable with the input value. Once we fill in this particular variable, the output that we get is called as a prompt. Now, this is a template which just has one single input variable, but there can be prompts which can have multiple inputs, which is the case over here. And now this is an example of a prompt template using chat models. So in chat models, we have different type of prompt templates. So we have the system message prompt template, the human message prompt template, and the AI message prompt template. And the chat prompt template, which is the one which basically takes in input the system message prompt and the human message prompt. So the system message prompt, it can be thought of as an instruction for the model. So it says you are a programming assistant that translates code from some input language to some target language. And the human message prompt template is an input text from the user basically. And finally, the chat prompt template takes in input system message prompt template and the human message prompt template. And finally, we during inference, that is when calling the format prompt over the chat prompt template, and we pass the input variables in order to generate the chat prompt value. Now there are different ways of formatting the prompt templates. So one way is doing it using strings. So we can basically call the format function on the chat prompt template object and pass the input variables to get the output as string. The second thing we can do over here is called the format prompt function over the object and pass in the input variables in order to generate the chat prompt value. And the third way is basically to generate a list of messages which basically contain the system message and the human message. So these are the three different ways in which we can basically output the output from the chat prompt object. And so it can have various use cases, and depending on the use case, we might leverage the type of output. And so generally for chat models specifically, we have, as we saw, we have the system message prompt template, the AI message prompt template, and the human message prompt template. But there might be scenarios or cases where we might want to create our own custom prompt template, and so that is what we are going to do over here. Now, the idea or the goal over here is to basically ask the model for like a function explanation given a particular function name. Yeah. And so the prompt template will basically take an input a function name and then retrieve the source code for the particular function name, and then we will essentially pass that entire prompt template to a large language model to basically get the function explanation. So we first create the function that we want to basically retrieve in our uh, prompt template. So we basically use the inspect.get source and the function name. So inspect basically helps us get the live information for a particular function, class, or any other type of objects in Python. And then we create this function explainer prompt template, which is a custom class which basically inherits the string prompt template from Langchain dot prompts. So the first function is to basically validate the input variables, whether the input variables being passed by the user is actually equal to the input variables present in the prompt template. And finally, we have to basically call the basically create a format function, which is a function in order to create the prompt. And so over there, we basically get the code, source code for a particular function name, fill in the prompt template with the function name and the actual source code, and then return the prompt. And so this is what we're doing over here. We're basically instantiating the uh, function explainer prompt template and then passing in the function name as input while we are calling the format function. So let's just quickly run it. So as you can see, we have the function name get source code, and we basically retrieve the actual function code and then basically create a prompt outfit. Next up, we have feature store. Now, feature stores are a traditional concept in machine learning where the idea is to basically feed the large language model data which is up to date and which is relevant. So let's say if we have a particular scenario where we want to personalize a particular application, so it's really important in that particular case to feed the model up-to-date and relevant information. So we will basically use an open source project called Feast, which basically helps us create a feature store and basically helps us ingest data or retrieve historical data from it. So first we need to go into that particular um, directory. Now once that's done, we will basically call this particular apply function on it, import the feature store from Feast. And so what is happening over here is that we have some historical data in this particular example, and so we are basically retrieving all the features given this particular information. For example, in this case, we have the driver ID, and given these particular timestamps, we are basically retrieving the con rate, the accuracy rate, and the average daily trips given this particular input information. And so here we have the driver IDs and the relevant features associated with this driver ID. Now, in order to get the up-to-date and the relevant information, we need to basically call the materialize incremental function from Feast. And let's say if we want to do some inference where we want to get specific driver ID information, we can basically pass entity rows in order to get the desired information. Now coming back to Langchain, how we can basically use this feature store in order to basically create prompts where we basically retrieve the relevant information and feed that into the prompt template. So this is our template, which has input variables such as con rate, accuracy rate, the average daily trips. So again, we will leverage custom prompt template over here, where the template name is feast prompt template, which inherits string prompt template class from Langchain prompts. The user will basically pass the driver ID, and we will basically fetch all the relevant information from the feature store, and then call the prompt.format by passing in the uh, retrieved information into the prompt template to create our final prompt. So this is how our prompt looks once we retrieve the information. So in this case, it says if the conversation rate is below 0.5, give above 0.5, give them a compliment. Otherwise, make a silly joke about chickens at the end to make them feel better. And so we will basically test this out using LLM chains by feeding in the prompt. So LLM chain basically requires a large language model as one of its parameters and the prompt template. So as you can see, in our case, the conversation rate was below 0.5. It basically tells us at the end something related to chickens. And so it basically tells us that this particular thing works. Few short prompt templates are very important. Is very important when you're basically building a very specific application. So the idea here is to basically pass model some examples so that it understands what you're trying to achieve. And so we can basically do few short prompting in two ways. One is using example set, and one is using the example selector class from Langchain. So in this video, we're going to look at example set. So the idea here is to basically create a list of dictionaries where you have two keys. One is the input variable to the prompt template, and the other is the value for that particular input variable. So as you can see, we have a list of examples over here, and so it's pretty straightforward. Like for example, if you want to just test it, we can see what it does here. But this particular code is basically creating a formatter for the example. So we basically need to transform the dictionary into a string format. So using from template, we are basically creating a way in order to format the dictionary into a string format. And so given a particular example, this is how the output looks. And so while we basically create the future prompt template object, we need to not only pass the examples, but we also need to pass the example prompt template, which basically tells few short prompt template that take these examples and format it in this particular way. Next, we need to pass the suffix, that is a question with the input from the user and the input variables denoting what is the input in this particular suffix. And finally, when we pass this particular input, that who is the father for Sundar Pichai, it basically creates the prompt where we essentially have examples as well as the input from the user. Now let's look at a few short examples for chat models. Now there are different ways of doing this. One is alternating human AI messages. So first off, we have the system message prompt or the instruction, that is your helpful assistant that translates English to pirate language. That is basically some sort of a slang language. Then we have different examples. So we have an example human variable, which basically is hi, and then we have another AI example, which basically is a slang transformation for this high value. And then finally, we have the human message prompt template, which is nothing but text variable which takes in the input from the user. Finally, we pass all of these different objects to the chat prompt template in order to generate the desired result. Now, the second way of doing it is using system messages. So instead of creating human prompt template and the AI prompt template, it's OpenAI basically allows you to pass name name a variable in additional keyword arguments as in additional keyword arguments, which basically associates that particular message to a specific role. So in this particular case, we have this associated with example human, and then we have the AI example associated with example assistant, and that could basically be anything. And then finally, similarly, we have the human message prompt template, which takes in the text from the user. And similarly, we pass all of this information to the chat prompt template in order to generate the desired result. Now, as we've seen, there are different message prompt templates. So we have the system message prompt template, the human message prompt template, and the AI message prompt template. And then on one level above, we have the prompt templates and the chat prompt templates. But this particular case is different as we've never seen this before. That is a chat message prompt template. And so what it does is that when you want to associate your prompt template to a specific role, you basically leverage chat message prompt template. So as you can see, we associate this particular prompt template with role def. And so the output chat message that we get is translate Python code to C++ with this role associated with it. So consider a scenario where you are not sure of what message to use in that particular scenario. So it's really important in that case to associate roles with it so that you know what role to use and in what scenarios. Another concept here is basically messages placeholder, which basically is some sort of a container which helps us store messages in it. And so over here we are creating a human message prompt template which says summarize the conversation in count words, which is basically an input variable. And then we instantiate the chat prompt template with messages placeholder and the human prompt. And then we feed in the human message and the AI message into this particular placeholder. And so finally our prompt then becomes it basically adds the human message, the AI message into the conversation container. And then finally we have the human message, which was essentially the human prompt that says summarize the conversation in about 10 words. Next up, we have partial prompt templates. So as the name suggests, we basically create partial prompts before we get to the final prompts. So that can be done in two ways. One is using strings. So let's say you have a particular prompt template which has two variables, and so you have the value for one input variable way before you get the value for the other. So in some use cases, it might be really helpful to create a partial prompt which takes in the value for the input variable whose value basically you know, and then create a partial prompt from it. And then we basically create the final prompt template once we get the information for the other input variable. Other use case could be with functions. So let's say you have a particular input variable which takes in live information, for example, date, which basically gets updated every time. And so it might be important to create a partial prompt rather than calling that particular function in the prompt template itself. Next up, we have composition, which is another feature of prompt templates, which I personally found really interesting. So what is happening over here is that we have a final prompt template. Over in this case, it's called the full template, but it basically takes in some input variables. Now, input variables in this are basically prompt templates in itself. So essentially, a final prompt template is created of multiple separate prompt templates, and then we basically create those individual prompt templates in a different cell which have its own input variables. So we have the introduction prompt template which says you are impersonating some person. Then we have the example template which basically adds more input variables called example question and example answer. And then we have the start template, which can be thought of as a suffix, which takes in the input from the user and then asks the model to output the answer. And so in order to pass this particular thing to the pipeline prompt template, we basically need to create a list of tuples, which basically takes in the introduction, which was the input variable in the final prompt template, and the actual template itself, pass the final prompt template as well as the input prompt templates to the pipeline prompt template. And so when we output the input variables, we essentially get all of the input variables which were associated with these different individual prompt templates. Finally, while calling the format function on the pipeline prompt template object, we need to pass all of these important values for these input variables. Let's quickly run this. Now, here is our final prompt once we fill in all of these input variables in the final prompt template. Now let's look at serialization. So the idea with serialization is that instead of storing these prompts and prompt templates as Python code, it's better to store them in files so that it's easy to store, share, and version them. So first off, we'll look at a very basic example. So the files in which we are going to see, in order to perform serialization, the files that we're going to use are YAML and JSON because they are very much human readable. And so this is the information stored or the description about the prompt template stored in simple_prompt or YAML file. And so we basically need to pass this particular file name to load_prompt function from Langchain in order to basically generate the final prompt. And it's pretty much similar with JSON. We have the same description about the prompt template stored in simple_prompt JSON file, and similarly we call the format function over the prompt object in order to get the final prompt. Now, as you can see over here, we have the template information stored in the template key. But let's say if you want to store the template in a separate file, so we basically need to pass the file name over here and change the key to template path. Now that was with normal prompt template class, but let's say if we want to work with examples in the few shot setting, we need to basically create another file called examples.json. I mean, it's not necessary to create a file, we can pass that in this particular setting as well, but it's important if you basically have a separate file for this in cases where you have a lot of examples and these examples are huge. So examples.json basically contains the examples in JSON format, which basically takes in the input variable and input variables. And similarly over here we have the examples of YAML file. Now how do we load the few short prompt template? So again, similar to the normal prompt template, we have the input variables, the prefix, the example prompt, which is basically how do we need to format the examples given in these example files, and finally we need to pass the file name over here and the suffix. And so this is how our prompt looks upon formatting the final prompt, and it's pretty much similar when loading examples from JSON. As you can see, the output is exact same. And finally we have the output parser. So in some use cases, if you want to basically load a prompt and basically perform some sort of parsing over that particular text in order to generate a JSON which has two different keys called answer and score. Lastly, in the prompt template section, we have something called as validate template. So by default, the prompt template class will validate whether the input variables match the input variables in the template string. And so if that's not the case, we will basically get this particular error because we have this input variable called input language, but that doesn't exist in the template string. So if we want to disable that particular feature, we need to basically pass validate template equals false in order to disable that feature and still execute our query. Thank you for watching the video. See you all in the next one.